What up, friends? Did you notice that my lighting is back to normal? That's because I was a fucking idiot last time. And today I'm going to be reviewing Billie Eilish's newest album, Happier Than Ever. The sophomore album from hit Californian singer-songwriter Billie Eilish has dropped after her 2018 debut, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? She really surprised me with her debut album, coming out of the gate strong with a pretty unique sound, and look no further for its influence considering that there's a lot of artists that are still trying to replicate the success of her debut album. And, of course, also trying to replicate its sound, too. Of course, it's not entirely fair to only credit Billie Eilish with her success, as even she's not shy in mentioning how it's more of a sort of team effort between her and her brother Phineas. He mainly handles the production side of things, and this dynamic largely continues on Happier Than Ever. While the album isn't bad, I think it kinda pales in comparison to the uniqueness of her debut. It's not the worst sophomore slump that I've ever heard, however, does have its problems, and it just kind of comes off boring at the end of the day. Getting Older is a pretty low-key start to the record overall. It has a simple beat and focuses mainly on Billie's vocals. Both elements don't really do too much to stand out, but they do sort of capture the narrative element of the album pretty nicely and kind of sum up what you're going to be getting into. The focus on Billie herself kind of explains how she tends to overshare and over-exaggerate her problems because she's just not good at dealing with her problems. It's a pretty raw moment on the album, however, I really do appreciate how she's gotten more and more okay in basically exploring these topics about her personality and her psyche. The delicate and simplistic beat and synths also serve to sort of wrap up these themes really well and serve as a good introduction to her emotional honesty. Now after that she's like, fuck it, we're getting serious now with the just jarring bark sample that comes in with I Didn't Change My Number. The sudden shift seems to represent the more tumultuous emotions going on inside Billie, and the track's more intense nature is also pretty fitting because of it. The darker, funkier rhythm and sinister synth and vocal passages are actually pretty reminiscent of her debut album. The whole track, from the barks being sort of interspersed throughout the track and her really interesting cadence here, it reminds me of why I really like Billie Eilish. She has that sort of subtle yet intense vibe, and this song actually kind of sees her standing up for herself in her relationship. It sees her sort of taking control of the situation, and that really harsh outro also fits this lyrical angle. Next up we got Billie Bossa Nova, and as the title suggests, it comes out a bit of left field. However, the sort of intricate and simple acoustic guitar strums, they do sort of mesh with the other ballads on the record, making it sort of grounded in that respect. They really have a sensual energy to them, and there's also these ethereal synths that are kind of interspersed throughout the track as well that hone in on that vibe. I think Billie's flow gives this track a pretty unique personality for the record, and while I will say that we'll see in the future how I think the album is a bit too ballad heavy overall, this is kind of how it's done, I think, and it's definitely one of the more interesting ballads on the record. Now, we're actually getting into one of my biggest problems, like I said on the previous track, with My Future. It's the sort of start of the really low-key ballads on the album, and I think the biggest problem that I have with them is how they pace them throughout the record. This one itself isn't really bad. It's not the worst offender on the album by any means, especially when it starts to pick up during the second half, but a lot of these ballads sort of sound the same instrumentally, and they don't really have a lot of distinctions that make them stand out from each other. This is especially true when you're kind of throwing them into the track list willy-nilly, like we get some really cool and funky dark electro sounds, and then we just immediately have this jarring ballad thrown in here and there, and it just kind of kills the vibe sometimes. The first half on this one just kind of exists with some pretty bare bones bass and Billie's admittedly good vocals. The second half picks up the pace a little bit, bringing the beat in, adding some subtler electric guitars, and I really like the lyrical angle because it's more of an optimistic track for Billie, which I think is really cool and does set this track apart lyrically from a lot of the other ones on the album. Oxytocin also calls back to her debut a little bit with the sort of whispered and vocal fry effects on her voice, along with a pretty dark dance beat. I also really like the contrast of the subtler flows during the verse and the more exasperated flows on the chorus. The dark groove of the track has a bit of an interesting angle to it, kind of expressing the darker sides of a relationship, perhaps an abusive one. And this especially comes true in the shouted vocals in the outro, along with those subtle guitars that are kind of wailing away in the background. Goldwing kind of sounds like Billie's attempt at a Björk track, weirdly enough. It's not terrible, although I do think it kind of stays in one place, and it does seem a bit unfitting for the record, in my opinion. It's also a bit too vibey for its own good. I like that repetitive sample and the crunchier beat. However, it just kind of feels stagnant and lacks direction. Lost Cause, on the other hand, is by far one of my favorite songs on the album. I love how bass-driven it is, and the sort of lazy, fed-up-with-it cadence that Billie has on her vocals are super fun. The track has a really lonely nature to it, with Billie sort of lamenting over how her partner doesn't really seem to try to understand her or even really attempt to make the relationship between them work. It has a pretty groovy beat, and those synths provide some pretty great texture, and I like how her vocals actually pick up a little bit during that last pre-chorus and chorus. Another notable track is Overheated, coming after Not My Responsibility, and it largely continues the same instrumentals and thematics. However, I think they do it in a lot more engaging ways here. I love how dark and foreboding the beat is, and I think it's really cool how they took the sample from the previous track and weaved it into this one in a bit of a different way. It has a sort of internal monologue feel, maybe expressing Billie's thoughts as she's being hounded by paparazzi and just the public in general, kind of how she's viewed as more of like a piece of meat or a person on a pedestal rather than an actual human being. The track is pretty sarcastic in nature with that glitchy beat and the vocal delivery, and I think it really does a good job in capturing the anxiety of being in situations like that. Now, the second half is pretty ballad heavy, I will say, even more so compared to the first. However, Your Power, I think, is one of the ones that actually does have a bit more of an identity for itself. I think the focus on the acoustic guitar and her voice do a pretty good job in highlighting the lyrics, and the lyrics themselves have a pretty confrontational angle to them that I think is really interesting. The subtle addition of more ambient moments inside of the chorus is also pretty cool, if used a bit too sparingly. I kind of would have liked a little bit of that in the verses too. I think the lyrical angle, talking about how older people date minors to have like a power advantage over them, is really important to talk about, especially because it seems like Billie went through this sort of thing. And I think it does a great job in expressing how damaging these relationships are. NDA is a pretty eerie one with that pretty intricate string plucking, and the chorus is simple yet effective at sort of building momentum in its energy. It also intertwines different electro sounds in a pretty fun way. The playfulness of the instrumental is kind of poking fun on how hard it is to date when you're in the public eye, with Billie basically thinking that she has to have all of her potential partners sign an NDA after they meet with her. The outro also adds a bit of intensity, expressing how what was once a minor annoyance is becoming more and more problematic the more and more famous she gets. Therefore I Am is probably my favorite track on this project, with some gritty bass and beats that also highlight how fun Billie's cadence is on this one. She's super charismatic here, and I love how catchy that chorus is, and it translates into the verses quite well. Like, if Billie had a bad bitch anthem, this is it. I also really love how she plays with her flows a lot and throws in some laughs to just kind of keep up the charisma. It also adds to that sort of sarcastic sense of humor that this track has. She's making it clear that she doesn't even care what people think about her. She's not even entertaining those thoughts, like when she's saying, "Stop, what the hell are you talking about? Get my pretty name out of your mouth." The title track, Happier Than Ever, is a banger that really encompasses how much Billie can take before she breaks. The simple acoustic build-up that adds bits and pieces of the bombastic outro into it before we get to that point really shows how Billie and Phineas sort of interweave all of her sounds that she's ever done into one track, essentially. Her vocals in the second half are emotive and powerful, and the overblown production just adds to these emotions. While the song is sort of a culmination of a lot of the sounds that she's explored in the past, it ends up being something completely unique and different for her. It makes it stand out in a way that no other track on this album really does, and the lyrics are pretty raw too. Other tracks that I didn't really talk about, like Haley's Comet and Everybody Dies, they're again just more ballads that are just there and don't really do much to stand out. They tend to blend into each other, and I really think it was a mistake to put Male Fantasy at the end of the album. It's not a bad track per se, but it's seriously an underwhelming climax, especially coming after the title track with that bombastic outro. Like, that was a perfect way to end the record. But when we go into this just quiet and sort of meandering song, it just feels awkward. Billie's newest project is a good attempt at honing in on her sound, however, it almost ends up too homogenized. For me personally, part of the fun of her debut project was seeing all of the different ways that she and Phineas can use that dark electropop sound to create different moods and ambiences. I like some of her newer experimentation, especially on Lost Cause, Overheated, and Happier Than Ever. Her returning sounds on I Didn't Change My Number, Oxytocin, and Therefore I Am are also, of course, really good. However, if you really think about it, that's only half of the album. The other half are ballads that, while not bad compositionally, do very little to stand out, and I just end up finding myself bored by them. Your Power is really the only one that kind of strays from that boredom, but even then, because of all the ballads, the pacing of the record is just kind of wonky and bloated, and moods are just constantly clashing, going from the funky dark electropop ones to the just simple ballads. The good tracks on the album tend to be really good, however, everything else just doesn't really leave much of an impression on me. I'm feeling a strong 6 on the new Billie Eilish record. It's definitely not a bad project overall, it's just not a very interesting one. Of course, we do have to talk about album covers on this show, and I think this is a pretty good album cover. I think it's a good evolution of a lot of the previous stuff that she's done. She's still at the forefront here, however, the colors are a bit lighter this time, maybe signifying that she's kind of on the up and up. Her pose is, of course, still the sort of sad, crying pose, so she's not completely better, but the cadence of the cover seems to signify that she is at least a little bit happier. The font itself just kind of exists on the cover to me. They didn't really try to integrate it into the cover, which I like to see done, or kind of make the type be a bold statement. I actually kind of preferred if the album cover was just her face and no text at all, but it's not a bad cover for what it's trying to do. Anyway, those were my thoughts on the new Billie Eilish project. Did you actually think this was a good improvement over her debut, or were you like me in feeling a bit underwhelmed by it overall? Let me know. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Ring the bell if you want to make me happier than ever. I'll even smile for you. But until the next one, farewell.